Hi, and welcome to Long-Term Strategy in a Short-Term World, where we're going to be talking about how it's possible to make long-term strategic decisions in a world where everything feels like it's changing, God, every day, every hour, probably. So if you find yourself on this call, it's probably because you're in this bucket. You're an executive, or you're running a business, or you're an entrepreneur, and everyone is looking to you to provide the answers. So people are expecting you to know what to do, and that's a lot of pressure on one person. And it's not like these decisions that you're being asked to make don't have consequences. It's true most of the time, but it's particularly true now, where we're in a moment in time where there are going to be some big winners and there are going to be some big losers, and it's going to all come down to whether you had a strategy that was resilient, that allowed you to make the investments that you needed to make. So by the end of the session, what we want you to do is we want you to be able to walk away and know whether you have a strategy that is resilient, something that's going to actually stand up to all the challenges of 2025, or whether you have something that is, well, it's reactive. It's something that's going to change this month and next month and 3 months from now, and that is going to just take you from doing one thing to another thing, and more than anything else, just burn you and your team out as you try to just keep up with all of the stuff, all the noise, everything that's going on. So if that sounds like something that you're interested in, then you're in the right place. And so let me introduce you first to myself and to Tim, who's, I guess, the real brains of the operation, before we get started. So I'm Ben Lee-Ralph. I have a background in product strategy, product design, and I've been working in the industry for about 15, 16 years now. I've run a very successful B Corp certified consultancy that specialized in user experience, product strategy, and organizational design. So Tim, who's sitting with me here, he's the real expert. Tim Stroh is a PhD in psychological influence on decision-making and motivation. He has decades of experience in starting, building, and selling very successful businesses. So this is not just something that works in theory, it's something that's been developed through hard-earned practice in the world of business. He's also an author of The Deeper Truth, and is here today to talk us through what is and isn't a resilient strategy. So Tim, I guess to kick us off, tell us, what is a resilient strategy?
So probably the critical aspect of a resilient strategy, it has two. First and foremost, it is resilient, by which I mean not that it's anti-fragile. I love Taleb's concept of anti-fragile, but in this case, it isn't reliant on, uncertainty, right? It can survive with, uncertainty, but its key characteristic is it's indifferent to change, right? The strategy is going to be effective, and work, and deliver the positive outcomes you're after, irrespective of anything but a complete black swan, market-changing, world-changing event, right? And even with some of those, it's going to be okay, right? It's still going to work. Second, it's an effective strategy, right? And we'll get to these, I'm sure, in a moment, but yeah. Right, if it's not simple enough for people to understand and apply, it won't get understood and applied, and it will fail. So it has to have certain characteristics that make it a good strategy or a useful strategy.
Yeah. In that first point that you made, it took me a long time. Like, we've known each other for a long time, and I think it took me many times going through this to understand what having a strategy that is impervious or doesn't care about change kind of means. And part of it is that it feels unbelievable. Do you know what I mean? Like, I kind of hear it, I'm like, everything that I've heard goes in the other direction.
Yep.
And so there's that component. And then there's the component of like, it isn't a magical formula. No. And so when you approach it, there are things that it can do and there are things that it can't do. And so part of, I guess, going through this process is understanding what a strategy is for, what it does well and what it doesn't do well. and having a concept where you'd be like, oh, I'll come up with a strategy for the next year on my own that will then have a series of steps, everyone will follow the steps, and then from there we will be wildly successful is not what we're talking about here.
No. It's a tool, and like any tool, right? Unless you use it, it doesn't do anything for you,
Yeah.
right? It's just a tool.
Yeah.
And one of our great conversations, and this would be great for everyone to be aware, is like I used to refer to these as certain strategies, or one of the rules was, does the strategy guarantee the outcome? If you execute it effectively, does it guarantee the outcome? And that was one of our great conversations, is to say, look, just referring to it in that way of it guaranteeing anything is problematic. It puts it into this realm that people just can't accept.
Yeah.
And I still, again, that's one of our, we've had many, but that was one of the great conversations about, okay, actually, we need to think about how to describe this differently, because that's absolutely correct, right?
Yeah.
It's indifferent to change. It accumulates advantage. It's not an all or nothing proposition, but ultimately, having the strategy and writing it down is a step. You have to act on it. It does not describe a plan. This is not such a simplistic exercise as, I've got my strategy, I'm going to win.
Yeah.
Right. It's essential, but yes, I 100% agree, and that should be clear to everyone here. Action is required.
Totally, yeah. It's like you can make this claim and then you're like, but there are ramifications. And it's like often with people, it's like their biggest weaknesses let you know what their greatest strengths are.
Yeah.
And so I think there is something about this resilient strategy, which is its greatest strength is that it gives you predictability in environments with great change.
Yes.
The trade-off is that it's not going to give you step by step, here's what you should do. It's not going to tell you you should definitely choose this technology. It's not going to tell you a bunch of these specific things that I would argue most strategies don't do anyway. But it is the claim that they make.
And or they risk that doing that, but they're picking the wrong ones because they were poorly informed. That's another characteristic of a resilient strategy, of a good strategy, is that it's a tool that people can apply to make decisions, to prioritize, to pick technologies. So, this tool metaphor is actually really, really powerful. A good resilient strategy is a tool. If it's not useful in lots of different ways, right, then it's not a good resilient strategy.
Yeah, it's like by definition isn't a resilient strategy. And I mean, you mentioned this already, but I think one of the key tenets of a resilient strategy is that it can be communicated to people.
Yes.
Particularly because whoever's in charge of picking the technology to go forward probably isn't the same person who's defining the strategy. And so this resilient strategy should be a way of giving this tool, to go on this analogy, is to give this tool to everyone who works at the organization so then they can make aligned decisions.
100%, right? And if you think about part of this definition of a rapidly changing world, right? All organizations are comprised of many individuals. If individuals all have to come back to a single person to make all decisions because only that person has a clear view of the strategy, well, that's going to slow you right down. In fact, by the time that little exchange occurs, the world may have changed yet again, and now a person is going back out and hang on a minute, what I just referred on is different, and I've got to do it again, and right. So it's not just a speed issue, right? But the more people you have, right? If anyone, all our audience here would have managed tens or hundreds of people before, right? They understand how difficult it is to get 10 people to do exactly the same thing, irrespective of any amount of training and time.
Yes.
Right. So if the larger the organization, the more people involved, the greater the rate of change, the more it's essential for effectively everyone to know not just how what they do supports the purpose of an organization, but how what they do and the decisions they make and how they prioritize their time are either furthering the strategy or not.
Yes.
Right? And if they can make those decisions on their own, because the strategy is simple and communicated and well understood, right? You have less risk, your response times are much quicker, you are less impacted by change, and you are having a greater diversity of people not needing to react to change. They've prioritized in a way that is indifferent to these little wrinkles, right?
Yeah.
The only time anyone has to consult is if it's a big wrinkle.
Yes.
So yes, it's got to be as simple as possible. It has to be clearly communicated, and it has to be understood by everyone.
Yeah, 100%. And I think one thing that's kind of become clear to me on this like communication principle is, one, it's helpful for large groups of people. But as someone who's kind of gone from working within very large groups of people to it's just me and my wife running Meet and Gather, being internally consistent within yourself from week to week to week is actually really difficult. That sense that like you're kind of 3 or 4 different people in the space of a month when things are changing, that actually to be able to look back and make a decision that was consistent to what you would have thought a month ago is actually very important. And important if you're an executive, because if you've got 4 meetings in a day, well, you've probably got a lot more meetings, but you've got 4 key meetings with different groups of people, feeling one way about something in the morning and then getting tired and feeling one way at the end of the day, that is something that's very human, but that having a strategy that you're constantly reflecting back on and not being like, oh, what was that again on the share drive, is like a key component here of being resilient.
Complex strategies are inherently more fragile, and for a broad variety of reasons. One of the most significant is exactly the one I think you've just described well, which is if a leader can rationalize a different response to multiple situations because the strategy is sufficiently complex that they justify, one decision, one action in one arena based on the strategy, but then a different decision in a different arena in a completely different way because the strategy is so complex they can do that. The probability that those are all aligned and supporting a direction and efficient and that staff are clear on what they need to do and interpret all the same, like you rapidly fall to zero. And we haven't even talked about why complex strategies are fragile due to external forces yet. So 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that it brings us down to our next one, which is, can people actually achieve it? And this, I also feel like sounds a bit stupid. You know what I mean? Just inherently, the idea that you would say something that either can't be achieved or achieving it wouldn't guarantee success for the organization are actually 2 things that once you get to the end of a large strategic planning process that's gone across multiple different parts of an organization isn't guaranteed.
100%. And a big issue here too is can your people work on it? Right? I mean, that's usually the bigger issue is it may be achievable, right? Wave a magic wand, unlimited resources, recruit all of the experts, etc. It may be achievable. But if the vast majority of your people can't actually work in a concrete way towards achieving the strategy, right? Okay, then it's not a good resilient strategy, right? Yeah. Its probability of working is going to be much lower again. It's this idea of being indifferent to change as opposed to guaranteeing, like if half your people can't work towards a strategy or 60% or 90% or even 20%, okay, you are by definition much more fragile. Changes are going to have a much bigger impact, right? If your profit margins are only 10%, but 20% of your people can't actually get their hands dirty pushing your strategy forward, well, just that could cause it to fail. And that aside from being inefficient, makes it a bad strategy.
Yeah, that's it. And I think it also pinpoints this idea that there are multiple reasons why a strategy might not be resilient to change. And one of them might not have anything to do with the strategic parts of it, right? Like given a different group of people, it might be the perfect strategy. But for the group of people that you have who can execute on this, and I think it's partly the people that you've got, but it's also the other work that they've got going on. There's also this big tension between, and you see this all the time, you go into HR and they'll be like, oh, I've got all these tasks that I've got to do today, and then how do I get onto these like important strategic actions that never get prioritized
Yep.
because payroll and all of these other things, that's what they're working on.
We've spoken many times about the prerequisites, right?
Yes.
Things
Yeah.
that have to get done, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know we've had the discussion that one of the most elegant, simplistic, but effective strategies ever written was the Allied strategy in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
One word, one sentence: survive, starve the enemy war machine.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, to your point. Survive, right? That was the first part of it.
Yes.
Right? Forget everything else, and to your point, like
Yeah.
if you run an organization, there are things you have to do to survive, right? Now, you have to be prepared to make trade-offs and bear costs and transition things, but that's another reason why you want a resilient strategy. So yeah, there are things you have to get done. You have to be aware of these. It has nothing to do with the external world. Well, limited contact to the external world and limited relevance to whether or not the strategy is going to be effective or not. And also to your point, right? A strategy can be great for one organization and effective and not for another. And in all of this context, it doesn't mean you can't make decisions to make changes about your organization in order to pursue one strategy or another. In fact, if it's a good resilient strategy, it will highlight exactly what those trade-offs should be, right?
Yes.
Why do you go one way versus another, whether it's resources or time or whatever else?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then looking down the list, I think we've kind of talked about everything, but just highlighting this idea that it ensures part of the strategy or working on the strategy means that the organization is going to be able to receive capital. Right? Like there is some element of these strategic initiatives that means that the organization is surviving. It is doing those core functions. Talk a little bit about, I guess, what you'd be looking for in a strategy in that area.
Any good and resilient strategy, right? And again, I used to say guarantees a particular outcome, right? I think a better phrasing here, and one that's more aligned with your eloquent letter breakdown for it. It's indifferent to changes in the marketplace because irrespective of those changes, when you execute this strategy effectively, it will deliver the organization the things that all organizations are fundamentally dependent upon, right? If you don't have capital, either in terms of investment or revenue from customers, right, your organization dies. It's only a matter of time. If you can't secure and keep staff, right, someday AI might deliver us a company that has no employees and is still effective. But today, if you can't secure good employees and keep them, your organization will die, right?
Yeah.
If you cannot, if you are insufficiently adaptable, and this is not to be confused with the strategy, but if the organization can't get information and act on it sensibly, okay, you're going to die. It's only a matter of time. So part of this proposition is that when you execute any good resilient strategy effectively, irrespective of changes in the marketplace, it is going to deliver your organization those three things, right? Or some combination of your strategy and your baseline prerequisite executions will deliver those things. And if it doesn't, well, your organization is going to cease to exist.
Yeah.
Whether you're a book club or, BHP in one of the largest companies in the world, you are dependent on those, right?
And the way I would see that, I think that's spot on. And the way that I think that often plays out is that it becomes a choice for organizations between strategy and surviving. So organizations who are, I guess, sufficiently sized with competent people in the various departments, which most are, recognize this need to hire staff, to make money, to do all of these core things. And so what happens is that the strategy gets dropped anytime people need to do tasks that are related to those things if the strategy doesn't incorporate those things at its core. And so the strategy will end up failing, I think, before the organization will, because they are built in such a way to make them robust, but it also means that they're harder to direct or control because they're just going to default back to what they were doing.
Well, and that's key, right? I think that is a essential observation for all modern leaders in any organizations, whether it's government, business, universities, anywhere, right? This view that came out of U.S. MBA programs in the 60s and 70s, right, looks at strategy as something to be executed at a point in time, right? And it's this notion of a complex plan somehow as a strategy, and I think what has happened is a lot of leaders who have, never studied the topic and or only studied the topic in terms of this kind of MBA view, have lost sight of what strategy really is, and it produces exactly the behavior you've just described, which is it produces plans that don't have at their core this kind of set of requirements, right? They don't look at how do we ensure we're going to succeed and survive. They look at we're operating at a point in time, we're going to optimize efficiency, we're going to optimize profitability in the next 3 months. We're going to pick one of these variables and focus on it. And because they don't have this more holistic view of strategy, they start down that path and then they get into a trap. The trap is that once you start focusing on those exclusively, it's really hard to go back to a holistic strategic execution. You're constantly chasing, oh, hang on a minute. Oh, the situation's changed. We've got to quickly adapt so we can pay our bills. Oh, the situation's changed. The customers want something so they're constantly being reactive, and that's a huge. We see that everywhere. Right? Companies are shifting towards reaction, and that produces bad consequences on more than one occasion.
Definitely, and I want to talk about that more, but. You've already mentioned, or you talked about, I guess, those kind of like MBA style programs. And I think one of the parts of a resilient strategy that spoke to me is that so often those programs are created based on studying organizations that have been successful. And I guess one way that stands out to me is I've just finished listening to the book written by the CEO of Nike about how they created the company. And I know that, the MBA book that I've got, but then also most of the big American programs all at their core have some of their syllabus around the Nike success story. It's just like one of those fundamental strategic success stories. Listening to his story, he didn't have a strategy. No. Like they're successful for lots of reasons, and they had a lot of components of strategy that made them successful. But this idea that is forced by, I guess, the educational system to think that he sat down on the first day and was like, here's the strategy that we're going to have, and then we're going to execute it, and then we're going to be successful, is not right. And so this idea that you could then follow that framework and be successful just feels counterintuitive. If people are being successful doing something and then you try and do something else, like there's obviously this big gap here.
We should be really, really clear, right? 90% of startups fail. 10% of them succeeded, right? Some percentage of that 10% became, billion-dollar, soon-to-be trillion-dollar companies, right? There's a radical difference between Jeff Bezos, who had a strategy from day one, and Mark Zuckerberg, who did not, right? The Nike example, right? There are lots of great case studies, and this is part of the problem with, I think, management literature in general, is that it, for years, has been dominated by a case study approach. And let's be clear, there's some great case studies, there's a lot you can learn from it, but in isolation, right, they can be completely wrong, right? And that is regularly the case. And hindsight gets applied, and incomplete information gets applied. Okay, I got news for everyone. Like my PhD in management, right? Been there, studied it, like I get it. I get to criticize it because I'm part of it, right? The case study approach is hugely flawed. There's a terrible survivorship bias and success bias in all the popular media, in all the academic literature, right? It's very easy to study successes. People don't want to talk about their failures, and if they're still around and you can find them. So failures are dramatically overlooked, but one of the great sources of critically important lessons. And forgive my rambling here, but the key commentary of introducing that, there are many examples, right? A surprising number of examples of organizations that have emerged and grown and been hugely successful to a point, right, without a strategy. Now, the one thing I would emphasize for everybody, well, that can happen, right? Blind luck occasionally pays off, right?
Yeah.
I love luck, right? And I don't want to disrespect these people. Like Mark Zuckerberg made a lot of, astute decisions, worked hard. Like, I don't mean to be disrespectful of his accomplishments, only that it wasn't because of a strategy, only because a lot of it was the right time and the right place. And the key reality here is it will all come to an end eventually, unless you have a good strategy.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that kind of brings us onto our next section nicely, which is, and to underscore your point, which is that not all successful organizations have had a strategy, but that what our promise is here is that if people are looking to you as a leader to have the answers, having a strategy that's resilient and predictable is one really good way of being able to provide people consistent answers that you can feel comfortable. So part of this is how can you be a successful organization, of which there are more than one way to do that. But if you want to get out of this, it's kind of like hamster wheel of like constantly leading by some amount of like learning and like quick decision making. Like there is a whole bunch of skills that you can adapt or that you can develop that allow you to kind of make these really split decisions, and then you can kind of navigate quickly and then be successful. Like that is a thing that people have done, and it's pretty stressful. And I think one of the biggest organizational ways of working approaches over the last decade has been agile. And I think based in the depths of agile is this sense that you can't predict anything. And so instead of trying to have certainty, instead of trying to predict, there is a series of ways of working that can allow you to function without doing that. And in some ways that works. And in some ways it's a very stressful place for you to be. So I guess the question I'll pose to you is, how much of the world can we predict? And is it worth spending the time up front to do that?
Well, I 100%, first and foremost. There are many, many aspects of future states that are imminently predictable, and people just aren't familiar with it or have been taught that it's not possible and therefore don't try.
Yeah.
Now, have to be really clear, there's a big difference between making precise predictions and accurate predictions, right? We can be exceedingly accurate about a lot of things, just not precise, right? I can't tell you on July 4th, 2042, event X is going to occur, right? Well, in some arenas you can, like in physics, right? If there was a meteor coming, where's the satellite going to be, that kind of thing, right? So there are actually some arenas where you can do that kind of thing, but in a business context, that's much more rare where you can do that. But you can be very, very accurate, right? We can say unequivocally that the demographics of certain regions are predictable 20, 40 years in advance. We can say unequivocally that legislation and laws and regulations increase, right? They ever so rarely have a downtick, but then they go back to this pattern of endless increase. So there are a lot of things that we can be very, very accurate about. We can be very, very accurate about science and technology, just not precise, right? Now, in most cases, accuracy is enough. Right? To your point about agile, and I would emphasize with everyone, trial and error is costly and has killed as many companies as it has served. And it's only that the deaths don't make the news with the frequency that the grand success stories, right, do, that people are unaware of that, right? It is a very, very risky proposition to just accept that the future is entirely unknowable and we're just going to be reactionary, right? If you look at the length of time companies make it to the Fortune 500 or the New York Stock Exchange or whatever, right? The average length of time has fallen from, I forget the exact stats, but 60 years or 100 years or something down to 20. If you look at the 7 largest companies in the world right now, all of them are younger than 40 years, some of them younger than 30 years. I mean, again, don't hold me to the exact stats, but you get the point.
Yeah.
Whereas that didn't used to be the case. And that is a direct byproduct of what we're talking about here. You don't, if an entrepreneur is wildly successful, excellent, everyone's happy. If they fail, well, what's the big deal, right? If you are a leader in a medium-sized organization and you make a bad decision that results in 3-5 years down the track, the organization ceasing to exist and everyone losing their job, even more so than a really big organization, right? That probably is going to have a very personal, real impact on a lot of people. And if you're in a big organization, right, it might impact larger numbers, right? These have serious ramifications, right? You don't want to mess it up. And if you're in a position of making policy decisions, right? If you're in government or something like that, well, actually, okay, most government policy is completely ineffective.
That's a different topic in the sense that there's the way it should happen.
We'll come back to that.
It does happen, but yes, no, I that's a rabbit hole I can predict with accuracy. No, I think one of the other things I think about this prediction component is that there is one stream that we've been told so frequently that you can't do it, and so you stop working that muscle, that whether your business succeeds or fails or not, it's just a very stressful way to live your life.
Yeah.
Like, it's just like when people talk about constantly being burnt out, it is because you're making the same decision over and over and over again. And it's why organizations have meeting after meeting after meeting. Because if you're not setting anything down and saying we don't have to revisit that for a little while because we're confident about it, then it just gets added to this mix of things that you just constantly need to talk about. And I think that there is like a human bias in there, which is that the stuff that's immediate, all the stuff that's changing and that we don't know, is what fills the front of our brain. Whereas actually taking the time to sit down and go, what do we know? And to what degree? Certain is an activity I don't think I've ever seen anyone do. No one's calling a meeting just to be clear, what do we know and what don't we know? But that you know more than, probably than you think you do, or actually what you need to do, what you need to know to make a decision is a lot less than you think.
Well, I would put the emphasis on, in fact, the latter, right? Good organizations have huge amounts of information that they don't utilize. That is an absolute true statement.
Yeah.
Would completely agree with you. I am shocked how often that it is a very useful exercise. Walking into a room of, senior executives, some of the most highly paid people in the world, and simply going through the exercise of, all right, let's start with what we know. What are the statements that we can make that are facts, right? Yeah, shockingly useful exercise. Not why we're here.
But
what is, I think, most salient for me with that idea in mind, though, is this idea of, if people focus more on what they do know and the rules, the laws governing this realm, right? In physics, you've got Newton's laws, right? And okay, we won't get lost in the detail of where they're right and wrong, but they have boundaries, right? But within those boundaries, they deliver tremendous predictive accuracy, right? This mantra, largely put forward again by MBA programs and consultants, that change, you can't predict the future, be agile, okay, rubbish, right? There are certain things that have never changed, right? Human nature is no different today than it was 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, right? Understanding the rules of human nature, right? Why do people do what they do, actually makes for future states to be much more predictable, right? I can tell you with 100% certainty that 10 years from now and 50 years from now, people are still going to be eating food, right? And that's of course, right? But people don't think about it.
Yeah.
Right? You're in the food business. Well, how often have you had that thought? You don't. You can be much more accurate than that too, right? People who express love by cooking, by making food for other people, right, are still not going to invite people over for dinner and serve McDonald's, right? Or, HelloFresh, like a pre-prepared meal, right? That's not what they're going to do. As a result, I can tell you unequivocally right now that 50 years from now, there will be a viable market for ingredients, for the raw materials that market will use to buy food. We have just made a prediction, tremendous accuracy, right? Exact precision, what ingredients, how will they package, right? Okay, no, I don't know. But that insight, right, and that same process of thinking can be applied to, a vast majority of industries, right? Because there are a set of ultimate drivers, of causes that people respond to, right? If you know them, then you can predict all kinds of things, right? And that's one of those rule sets. So I will put to you much more predictable. I talk about technology on a regular basis. I teach innovation. Technologies all follow a consistent trend, right? That there's a theory. Then somebody proves the theory in the laboratory, and then someone proves that the laboratory experiment can be done at a bigger scale. And I won't go through all the steps, but you wind up in a specialty application and then a more general application. That trajectory is pretty universal, right? It lets us predict all kinds of things about the future with reliability, right? Now, as much as we can do that, and that is really useful when crafting a resilient strategy, I would also emphasize that the resilient strategy should work because it's indifferent to a lot of changes. Now, it's hard to identify goals, objectives, ways to get capital in, attract customers, attract staff, if you don't know these ultimate drivers, what these rules are, right? So there's a combination of these two things that is important if you're crafting a strategy to ensure that it's resilient.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think translating that into what is the research that sits behind a resilient strategy, and what's the story about how you've kind of developed this new thing. And the way that I guess I will introduce this or frame this is that one of the things that I've seen a lot, specifically recently, but also this is just a trend of consultants and something that I've done a lot, right? This is this idea that you would come up with a framework or an approach or a canvas that allows people to be if you follow these steps, you will create a strategy, is something that you see all the time. I sent you one just the other day via email, and I'm the content of it doesn't even matter, but you can just tell by the way that this is being framed that you follow this and you do this and you do this, and then you end up with a strategy. And the reason that I know that that's not going to work is that organizations never get to this point where they don't have a strategy and that they're starting from scratch, and that they're then going to go and follow this set of repeatable things, repeatable steps, I guess, to then come at this glorious strategy. And so there are times when I look at frameworks like that and I'm I don't know if it would work, but what I can tell you is that organizations are not set up to develop strategies that way. And so one of the things that I really like about this resilient strategy approach is it almost takes it the opposite way, which is that you can review whatever strategy is there. Say, this is fragile or non-resilient in X, Y, Z ways. And then there are tools or ways to then build robustness into that strategy. But it just seems like it's built in a way that organizations can consume, and not assuming this intellectually pristine starting point. So yeah, just tell us a little bit about the story of where it came from and why you're so confident that it would work.
So a series of questions within even those two questions.
Yes.
The core aspect of the story, for me, starts. In fact, it goes to prior to my PhD. As you know, long history of starting businesses and building them. I had some that did very well. I had some that didn't do well. My overwhelming conclusion from the exercise of pitching businesses was that logic wasn't the driver of these decisions, right? Of whether or not they succeeded or failed, right? And that was something that was very hard for me. Now, that said, I had a couple of examples of startups that really had everything, right? That they ticked all of the boxes, and yet, despite following the advice of successes and esteemed colleagues, they failed. I started looking around. My realization was that all of the evidence, all of the research, all of the propositions about, these have succeeded, here's this tool. For 50 years of 70 years, 100 years of MBA programs and studying management, et cetera, we still average a 90% failure rate, right? If you look at new product development efforts, innovation efforts, entrepreneurial startups, attempts to translate research out of universities into societal impact, right? 90+% fail, right? Now, we don't have a 90% failure rate on brain surgery, right? We don't have this is astronomical, right? Like the only industry that has a worse success rate was music publishing, while they still existed, let's say, right? 98% of albums failed, right? So I just looked at that and went, okay, hang on a minute, right? We don't understand, right? That's the only explanation. We can't possibly know what we're doing, or our underlying understanding, our understanding theoretical framework has to be wrong for us to continue to have this kind of failure rate.
Yeah. And just to add in there, I always find it amazing how much we've just internalized the idea that failure is a part of business, to just completely write off this idea that 90% is fine. Like, so much of the structure has just been built around the idea that 90% can't be changed. And so let's just accept it, and then we'll build all these ways of working that can accommodate that, from ways of working in an organization, but all the way through to VCs and funding, all of these things are built on the idea that it's just unpredictable.
Yep.
And so, not to interject, but it is amazing how much you can be a fish swimming in water and not realize what water is.
There's a whole philosophical dialogue on that. I won't go there.
Yeah.
But I'm totally agree. And for me, this was okay. I've had a much better success rate than 90% fail, right? I hazard a guess, and there are definitions of success, and was this a success or not? But a much better success rate. I've had a much better success rate raising capital. I was getting asked for advice from a lot of people, and I was always happy to get it. But I always was compelled to go, look, I'm happy to try and help, but I got to be honest with you. This worked for me in this context. I don't know if it's right for you. I felt really uncomfortable just being, free with advice without putting all these contexts around it. You were a recipient of that at one point in time.
Yeah.
Now, what that made clear to me is, we don't know. A 90% failure rate isn't required, right? That you can do much better. And part of my review of the available data was finding a number of examples where, here is a CEO who moved from one company to another and delivered success every time, well above whatever the industry was doing, right? This wasn't, and for the record, sorry, senior executives, there's a lot of research that basically shows that basically your company is going to perform as the industry does may be marginally better, but it has nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
Right. But there are examples of ones, okay, the unequivocal, this individual delivered a huge outcome, right? There are also examples of CEOs, or founder CEOs, right, but in particular founders, who haven't just started one company successfully, but have started multiple companies successfully. And the success wasn't tied to just having more capital, right? Elon Musk, love him, hate him, whatever, he's had a number of wins, but a number of his wins can really be attributed to the fact that he just had more capital when he started. And again, no disrespect to him, right? He's had more than one win. But there are these examples of entrepreneurs who, right, they clearly know something, they're doing something repeatedly, and it's working. They do not have a 90% failure rate. They have a 50+% success rate, right? Okay, we can learn from this. So those were the two kind of starting point elements.
Great, and I wanted to underscore that thing about Elon Musk as well, which is that I think a lot of times people are looking for advice from people who have done things that you're not trying to do.
Yeah.
This sense that someone who is running a multi-billion-dollar or a trillion-dollar like approaching business, that we would look at Google or Apple and go, well, what do they do? That's what I'll do. That's not what you're doing. No. And so it's not necessarily to say that they're bad or good, or they know what they're doing, they don't know what they're doing. It's just like they're not doing what you're doing. And so I think that's kind of what we're talking to here is a much larger group of businesses or organizations who aren't realistically looking to become trillion-dollar American conglomerates, and taking advice from them seems pointless.
Well, and what you need to do to succeed, or what might cause failure at different stages and in different contexts, to your point, is different, right? Even if they have a really good, insightful view, informed and are correct for a certain stage or set of context, they might be completely wrong in this one, right? That really can't be understated, right? And it's not to say don't collect these people, that sounds terrible, but not to say that, don't have relationships with these people and take their advice, but it is very much, matching to need that is required, because if you're wrong, you think about scaling too soon, you don't think about it at all. When you're 5 people, that could kill you because you invested in something you're not going to need until you're 100 people. Okay, example out of context, but
no, absolutely, yes. Yeah. Fantastic. So I think that kind of brings us to the point where what I want to do is kind of spell out our framework for, I guess, measuring a strategy to whether it is something that we would say is resilient versus something that we would say is partially resilient, reactive, which you spoke on before, which is, I think, where a lot of people live. They live in this world where their organization is succeeding based on their ability to react quickly, which again can work, but is very tiring, very stressful, and allows a lot more luck in than I think you'd love to accept.
Yeah. I should be clear on that too. Like being effective, right, in reacting to change is not a bad thing, right? Agile. Everyone wants to be agile, right? No one wants to be, I don't know, the opposite of agile. Like that's just, you're stuck, you're a rock, you can't move, right?
Yeah.
So I don't want to, again, poo-poo any of the tools, right? Many of them are good. In the absence of a strategy, though, agile can only keep you alive for a period of time.
Yeah.
Right? Once the world changes, right, if it changes dramatically, no amount of agility is going to allow you to have a large organization that can deal with, a substantive change. Absence of a good strategy, right? That large organization is going to feel pain, and yeah.
Totally. And I think one thing that's actually interesting about this current point of time when it comes to, say, having a reactive or an undefined strategy, which is kind of the next one down on our tiers, is that the promise, whether it plays out or not, but the promise of AI agents and AI tools in the workforce is that they're going to, say, 5 or 10x the productivity of an individual. And whether that happens or not, I guess my point is, if that does happen, increasing the productivity of all the different people in your organization, if they're not all aligned around the same goal, is going to almost just amplify this problem of trying to continually being reactive to things that are happening. Like at the moment, if you've got a pace of change where sales is doing something that's not aligned with marketing, that there are lots of points where those groups of people intersect and can find the flaw. Or if they're delivering these campaigns, they're happening on a 3, 6, 12 month kind of time cycle, which again gives you a little bit more time to like coordinate and react. But if you've got these teams that become radically smaller and all of the work is being outsourced to these bots that are working kind of at the speed of light, it just throws open the consequences of not being aligned in a way that like makes strategy so much more important. And I think I say this for people who are kind of sitting there going, well, I'm holding on right now, you know, like I think I can kind of brute force my way through, in that brute forcing might kind of get to a point where it isn't as sustainable as even it is right now.
AI is just another technology. Is it accelerating change of a particular type? Yes, right? Does it matter? I would argue no, right? And okay, provocative statement, but if as a company, as an organization, as a team, if you have a really good strategy, AI is just another technology to choose to use or not use because it helps you achieve that strategy. If it does, great. If you don't have a strategy and you're using it exactly as you've just said, what it's most likely doing is accelerating and or getting you to a point where your fragility is amplified rather than minimized, right? You are going to be not indifferent to subsequent change, but tremendously sensitive to it. And we want to avoid that. Now, back to this what's predictable and what's not, right? Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to talk about meta,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And its absence of a strategy. But in this case, it's relevant because if you don't understand the fundamental laws of human nature, and going back to what's the evidence, you know, supporting this approach to strategy, like there's a whole body of evidence now about what is predictable about human behavior, right? Everyone might have heard of the book Predictably Irrational, right? Now even it actually assumed less predictability than there is, right? That's kind of old science now. New science has basically gone, all right, we can be very definitive about the ultimate psychological and neurological forces that produce decision processes and behaviors. This is part of a big spectrum of research that underpins this approach. But it's fundamental, right, to do you use AI or not? Well, if your strategy is to appeal to a particular customer base who is reliant on a sense of belonging, and you just adopt AI without explicitly using it to increase that sense of belonging, right? It's going to have the opposite effect that you thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also a good example of what strategy is and what strategy isn't. A strategy, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but a strategy isn't let's adopt AI or let's not adopt AI, right? Or like there are these things that include, like I think AI is something that's going to prove to be quite important, but this sense that like AI is good or AI is bad or we should do it or we shouldn't do it are not in themselves strategy, because they don't provide any of that underlying rationale that would provide people a decision-making framework to decide how it gets implemented in a particular way.
I love the example of emergency room doctors, right? Now, it's an inherently reactionary environment, or so it would seem, right? But it really isn't. Really good ER doctors are good ER doctors, and I don't know, you can get one on and interview them, and they can tell me I'm wrong about this, but as I understand it, right, they're good because they actually have really good strategies for dealing with crisis situations, and it is a strategy, right? If someone's hemorrhaging, right, they have a strategy to deal with it that involves kind of a layered approach to different interactions and tools and, right, new technologies, and if a new technology comes in, it doesn't change their strategy, right? And they will use it or not if it helps with a particular approach to stopping hemorrhaging, right? Okay, it's just, AI is just another technology, right? Jets came along in World War II, right? Didn't change strategy. So what? Just another technology.
And that's something about, I think, these domains of, say, like medicine that you brought up then, or war, or these things that have very definitive goals that make, I guess, defining strategies in that area, maybe not necessarily easier, but it makes it really clear what you're optimizing for. Whereas I feel like strategy in the corporate world often gets fuzzy for that lack of people's ability to kind of sit down and being like, keeping people alive is good and not having people, like there are still those correlations, like there are still ways to find that, but it gets fuzzy.
As we spoke about earlier, right? If you're a senior executive, it's very easy to go, oh, well, my job is actually to optimize profit and therefore shareholder return in the next 90 days or something, in the next quarter, right? Now, I would put you a prerequisite of even having a good discussion about strategy, let alone coming up with one, is defining success.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't define success as long-term organizational survival, as return on capital over the long term, right? Okay, then we have a different discussion, right?
Yeah.
If you don't care if the organization survives 90 days, your strategy will be completely different than if you do, right? But that trap, if you haven't thought about this at all and you just think, oh, maximize profit this year, right? You're not going to have a strategy. You're going to have some plan for achieving that short-term goal. B, you're going to get into a trap, right? The organization is going to get into a trap where it has to react in order to survive.
Yeah, and I think that brings us onto that like last level that we would have in our framework, which is fatally flawed strategies. And I think it can underline this idea, and people can get themselves into this position where they have a strategy, everyone knows it, it ticks all the other boxes, but actually if you followed it, if it worked, it would be the end of the company.
Yeah.
And I think often where they come from is, one of the underlying tenets or pillars that you would talk about is this idea of novelty. But like sitting down with a group of people and saying the success of the organization is about bringing in money doesn't seem that novel. Like the amount of strategic conversations you've been in where you're like, let's define success. And someone will ultimately be like, well, bringing in money. And then someone else will be like, oh, God, it's actually all about these other things. It can be true, but we don't spend time thinking about like what are actually fundamentally the things that we need to be doing here, because they're not novel, but they are important. So if you build a strategy that isn't about delivering some of these maybe boring or fundamental things, it can lead you down a path where if you are successful, you will be unsuccessful.
Yes, I'm going to be redundant, right? There are a set of prerequisites to organizational survival, and if you don't have them, your organization will die. Right? And the strategy is not necessarily defined just to ensure those prerequisites, but any strategy that doesn't ensure the prerequisites is going to fail.
Yeah.
Full stop, end of story, predictable.
We've got our levels of what a resilient strategy is. I'm sure they'll be posted somewhere along this video so you can follow along. But essentially, resilience at the top and fatal is at the bottom. And so what we want to work through now is just, I think, the most practical version of this. And what I'd recommend people do is to pause or take a second just to like note down what they think their organizational strategy is right now. Just like have it front of mind. And spoiler alert, I think that might be difficult. Like even just this element of like, do you know what it is? Could you write it down? Would 3 or 4 other people in your organization also be able to do that? Is kind of this first step. But do that. And then as we go through here and we talk through the steps, just apply it or try and test it as you go. We call this the Clear Plus framework. And I guess we'll talk about it as we go through with some examples to make it practical. It's a little bit of a bugbear of mine, in that often when you have people talking about strategy, they don't want to put themselves on the line of saying what is good and what is bad, and so it becomes high level. Whereas I think we're going to try and hold ourselves a bit accountable. Well, we'll see.
Cool.
You can be the judge. Okay, so in the Clear Plus framework, the first thing that we have is, can it be communicated?
Yeah.
So why is that important?
See. Well, and we've touched on this.
Yeah.
If everyone in an organization if the strategy cannot be communicated to everyone in the organization, they hear it and don't understand it, or can't understand how it relates to them, right? Then they won't execute it. They can't help you support it. Well, random chance, maybe they will, but
Yeah.
right. The reality is you're not going to get efficient, aligned action if it can't be communicated and understood. So it's got to be relatively simple. It's got to be easy to communicate, and it's got to be easy to understood, or you suffer consequences, and those consequences are inefficiency, people acting contrary to the strategy, thinking they're doing the right thing. You know, you get all kinds of negative consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. And you only get the benefits of a strategy, I think, if people can understand it. So if people don't understand it and they're not using it in their decision making, then the point of having a strategy is like significantly diminished in my mind. And so it's first for that reason, and it's often where people are stumbling. And maybe a little nuance I would throw under it, which is, well, not even nuance, but like there was a way I was thinking about it the other day, which is that there are a lot of strategies that, if said out loud, you know, like they've been like boiled down to these parts, you know, they're probably in a sentence or two, but that if you told them to someone outside of the organization who maybe was still in like primary school or high school, they could tell you that that probably wasn't very good. Or they could tell you that they didn't understand it. But no one else will tell you in the organization that like, it doesn't make sense to me. Or I don't understand what those words are saying in that order. And I think that's a large part of communicated is not, can you put it in an email? Not, is it under a set word length? But do people genuinely understand what the words mean?
That's the test.
Yeah.
Right. If the response to a beautifully elegant description is, why would we care? Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, it doesn't matter that they heard it and perceived it a certain way and think they understand it. No. It's can you communicate it effectively? Do they understand it? Can they restate it and apply it? Right. If not, right. If you take them all out of the room and distribute them for a month and bring them back and say, right, now each describe the strategy in your own way and how you've applied it in an aligned way, and everything that comes back agrees, okay, then you have a clearly communicated strategy. If you don't,
then it's not.
Then you don't.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. And I think this is the time to kind of say that this isn't easy.
No.
There are a lot of things that get packaged up as something that is very easy to develop. And I would kind of suggest that creating a resilient strategy is not that.
I don't want to say it's hard, but
Yeah.
it's not easy. Right?
Yes.
It does require thought and intellectual effort and usually some experimentation, not to experiment with the strategy, but to experiment with how to communicate it.
Yeah.
Right? And that, I can't emphasize that enough. People think, oh, okay, now it's clear. It's a soundbite. No.
Yeah.
The test is not that you get it down to a soundbite. The test is, and this is a great experiment. I've done this with companies. You go in and you pick, 10 random people at 10 different levels and go, right, what's the strategy? And how do you use it? And what you discover is, if they've got it memorized, that's great, but they often don't understand. They've all interpreted it differently.
Yeah.
The salient bits have been lost in the sound biting.
Totally. And I would also, you can tell me whether you agree with this or not, but I would also say that in organizations who are successful, that don't necessarily have a strategy or a resilient strategy, often what they're doing is they're doing the same job of creating this decision-making framework, either through like a very well-communicated leader who people all kind of respond to and understand the way that they think, or you've got a clear culture, but you've essentially got this mechanism where everyone in the organization be like, in this moment, what would Steve Jobs do? Or what would the culture dictate that I do? And I think a lot of, particularly Japanese examples where they talk about all these different processes and systems that they follow, it wasn't maybe necessarily the system that they followed. It was this mechanism that they all knew at a point in time, what's the right thing to do here based on a culture. And so I think that's part of this too.
Short answer, yes. Right? I can be redundant, but whether it's asking what would Steve Jobs do, or how would Jeff Bezos approach this, or in the examples of Japanese companies in the 50s and 60s, well, post Peter Drucker, okay, if everyone goes, basically our strategy is to produce the most reliable, high quality car at the lowest cost price, as an example,
Yes.
right? At that time, that was a beautiful strategy.
Yes.
And we could use that. We can talk about how it matches the other criteria. And so to your point, whether it was stated, whether the label is not important, having it is important, right? And so, yeah, I'm about to be redundant, so I'll stop myself, but yes.
Yeah. Is there another example there that you kind of like?
I think, well, those examples are all good, but I think the Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos examples, because this is much more common in founder-led businesses,
Yes.
right? But if you look at the emergence of AWS within Amazon as an example, another leader was brought in. The leader effectively just put forward, we're basically going to take the original strategy and apply it in a particular way to, cloud-based computing and support systems, right? And while it wasn't stated, this is going to be AWS's strategy,
Yeah.
right? It's exactly as you described. It was a leader basically saying, look, here's how we're going to make decisions. Okay, just because they didn't label it that doesn't mean that it didn't function in exactly that way. And it was a statement of intent, if you will, that was encompassing of certain principles, right? It ticked all of our resilient strategy boxes, and it was hugely successful, right? I probably should give that one much more detail, but another time.
No, absolutely. And we could talk about all of these much more. But I also think there is an element where we could talk about them forever, but there is also an element where you stop this right now, you look at the list, compare it to your strategy, and you'll probably have a pretty good gut feel about where you sit. It's not, rocket surgery or whatever they say. So there was C. L is, can it be leveraged? So can you kind of talk us through, what does that mean, and what are some strategies that either can or can't be leveraged?
This critical idea of, can your people actually work on the thing, right? If people can't use it as a tool, right? They show up at their job every day. They understand the strategy is, for example, Disney, which is to dominate high quality family generational entertainment, right? I think I've seen different ways in which they've phrased it, but you can all kind of drag them back to that, right? If you know that's the strategy, and you can, I don't know, you're a support staff at one of the parks, right? And you're walking to your office and you see a piece of trash in the walkway, right? Okay, if I know the strategy, right? How is a family with a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old and is that a good look or not, right? Well, you can actually apply the strategy to that simple, little situation, right? Do I pick up the trash or don't I? Well, at Disney, they pick up the trash, right? Nobody asks. And that's not just because someone told them that that's what we do, right? This as as an execution, forgive me if I'm rambling here.
No.
And I've got to emphasize that I've been told this story, I don't know it to be 100% certain. So if anyone knows it's false, please let me know.
Yeah.
But it's a great story. A company used one of the Disney animated characters in some promotional material. Now, Disney being Disney immediately sent a cease and desist letter saying, hey, look, that's our property. We can't have you doing that, right? Now, if anyone has ever received a cease and desist letter or instructed one to be sent, then you know that most of these things are just they're intended to scare the recipient. They're vicious. They want the recipient to read it and go, I am so scared, I am going to immediately cease and desist, right? And they're full of legalese and they're just terrible, right? I've been told this story. My recollection is I actually saw an overhead projected copy of this letter, right? Disney's lawyers didn't do that, right? They wrote this beautiful letter that was complimentary and nice, and if Mickey Mouse was on the other side going, look, you did a really good job of using it, right? But we need to have you stop, and here's why. Like, it was just this beautiful thing that when you read it, you wanted to follow it.
Yeah.
You were like, oh, yeah, okay. And it was completely aligned with the strategy and the brand identity of, well, if this was the parent of a family, like, we don't want to lose them as a customer. We're going to support our...
Yeah.
So this idea of leverageable, if it's not a tool that everyone can use, then it's not a good strategy. It needs to be a tool you can use to make decisions. It should tell you what not to do and what to do, and not just that, but how to prioritize. Do I do this or that first, right? Which one is more important, right? If it's not a tool to help you do that, you can't leverage it.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to something that you were talking about previously, which is that if you've got a reactive strategy, which is, generally speaking, someone has sat down and looked at the numbers and said, we've got a profit problem coming up, then constructing a strategy around solving that one particular metric or that one particular problem is going to, I guess, necessarily mean that you're focusing on only certain parts of the business. Those are the people who you probably brought in to construct the strategy, and it leaves everybody else not being able to use it to create decisions, which, at best means that they're not helping you with the problem that you're trying to solve. And at worst, they're probably making it worse or doing a whole bunch of stuff that is making its way up the chain and then getting said no to. Like, oh, let's do this, no, let's do this, no. And that's because you've constructed a strategy that isn't applicable to large swaths of the organization.
Applicable or aligned.
Yes.
Right? I would argue or I would put forward, I don't think I need to argue, I think it's a fact-based assertion that you can craft strategies for individuals. Like, an individual within a company can have a strategy. Teams, whatever your unit size in the company. But if the strategies are not aligned, you're going to have that problem. And depending upon how not aligned they are, you certainly compound things, and you can have very effective strategies for achieving certain short-term goals. And in most cases, what they're going to do is make some other required activity of the business more fragile. That's the reality, right? You are amplifying the susceptibility to change, right, by focusing on any one of these things. And that it's unnecessary. You don't have to do that, right? Everyone can have aligned strategies for achieving short-term goals that are aligned with the long-term picture, if they're aware of what that long-term picture, long-term strategy is. If they're not, revert to item one. If you haven't communicated it, they don't know, okay, you're going to have that problem.
It actually kind of lends me to one of those toxic corporate traits that I've often seen people do, which is that they kind of set up, or there's this idea that you could just set up two teams to kind of compete with each other within the organization, right? Like, you do this, and whoever wins, at least we've got someone who's winning. And I think it comes from a place where that could succeed, but people apply it in a way that instead of making these two teams aligned to the same strategy and one person will figure out how to achieve that first, they're given completely different briefs or tasks, and they're working at odds with each other across the organization, which just builds all of this resentment. And so there's a sense that competition isn't bad, but competition where people are being pitted against each other with unaligned goals and objectives, that's really problematic.
Experimentation is good.
That's a better way of framing it, yes.
But yours is a very black and white. I mean, that we've seen that happen, right? We can point to lots of big companies, lots of people would have firsthand experience with exactly what you've just described, right? And it's always inefficient, right? Even if one side wins, somebody loses by definition, right? Yes. It's wasteful for the company, and there's no reason you can't run those experiments without both teams simply being aligned with a particular strategy and realizing, great, friendly competition, but friendly competition, not one side's going to lose their jobs because the other side won, which, oh, by the way, again, if in the absence of a strategy, that can produce some short-term gain, but we've got to be really clear. The team that wins is producing something that has a finite viability, not delivering huge long-term, corporate sustainability, right? That not going to do it.
Yes, that's absolutely right. So we talked about communicated, we talked about leveraged, and then I think we then moved into talking about can people execute on it as a part of that.
Sorry, yes.
Of course. No.
Leverageable, it's a tool. Can they actually do the thing? Can they actually work on it? Right, yes.
100%. And there's two sides of the same coin, really. So then that brings us on to the next A, where we're really asking people, can it withstand change? Right, so this is, does it develop a cumulative advantage?
Yeah.
So walk us through what that looks like.
So good strategies are not all or nothing propositions, first and foremost, right? If you have to completely successfully execute and achieve some state, some set of conditions before you get any benefit from it, right? It is by definition a fragile strategy because, what happens when you don't, right?
Yeah.
People tend not to take all or nothing strategies in military situations where life is on the line, right? You want to avoid them in healthcare, right? They tend to be risky, but surprisingly, in business, right, they're much more common. What you're really looking though for is something that as you execute it, as you work towards this set of conditions that you're describing that deliver your success, right? You're accumulating advantage, right? You get little wins and that makes you more viable. That gets you more capital in, more customers, more staff, building towards this end state. If that's the case, then that's a characteristic of a good strategy, right? If it doesn't, well, then you're fragile, you're resilient. You're going to have, you might as well be gambling.
Yes, and I think that's a point we've probably made already, but that I really want to underscore is this sense that you can have a strategy that isn't resilient and be wildly successful. Yes. And there are lots and lots of examples in modern culture, the books that you're picking up at the airport. A lot of those are telling stories of organizations who did just that. They had a strategy that could have failed, but that we're putting these people up on the pedestal because it didn't. And it's not necessarily to say that's good or that's bad. It's just to say that it depends on what your goals are.
Very much so, right? Your risk tolerance, right?
Yeah.
In some cases, if you don't know enough, like entrepreneurs regularly have an excuse for less strategic thinking. I would advise against it, right? You can have a much higher success rate by thinking strategically, but limited informational awareness, limited resources, willingness to pivot, willingness to fail. Like, okay, if that's your game, that's fine, right?
Yeah.
IBM is a great example of a company that's had multiple strategies over time, right? Importantly, these things don't change a lot, right? IBM didn't change its strategy every year. They adopted a strategy that worked for them for 20, 30 years, and situations did, finally the world changed enough that they had to come up with a new strategy. I would put to everyone that there are far more successful companies that had good strategies, right, than ones that didn't, right, that became hugely successful.
Yeah.
Right? There are far more unicorn companies you've never heard of than, the 10 that get all the press. So please don't just look at, these small number of isolated examples, right? That's not what you're going to learn from. That's actually a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and I think it's the difference between what you're trying to do, I guess, in the sense that, are you trying to run a startup, even in a big organization? Are you trying to take these principles of a startup, which essentially do take a lot of the strategic decision out of it for speed, bringing in luck, or are you building a business?
I'm going to argue that's an illusion.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily
understandable
saying that it's not.
perception, right? But even in a large organization that wants the benefits of agility, that wants the benefits of startup culture and innovation and all of those things, you need a willingness to let startups pursue opportunities, right? but you still want that to be sufficiently aligned with some high-level strategy, or you're going to get diminished benefits from it, and we can go into all kinds of reasons why those are likely to get killed off and or fail that have nothing to do with whether or not it might have been successful or not.
Totally,
So,
which I think that's spot on. And a way of framing it, I'd say, is that there aren't that many examples, or you could tell me whether there are or not, but there probably aren't that many examples of like startup culture in large organizations delivering success stories, because they're often sectioned out into this area without a governing strategy. And it's probably more likely that those wilt away before the actual core entity does, probably for that reason.
Yes. Yeah, we could go into a lot of detail there. I don't want to discourage anyone from trying to spin out startups or create startups, or like innovation is fundamental to growth and good strategy produces good innovation. In fact, innovation starts with good strategy, in my opinion. That said, I think your observation is correct that in the vast majority of instances where companies have started other companies, they're successful because they are exited from the immune system of the core, which is another reason why strategic alignment is so important. Or while capital benefit can come back in, right, the overall benefits achieved are far less than could have been.
And then one other thing that I resonate with in this particular point actually doesn't come from the corporate world at all. It's more comes from, there's a very popular book that talks about this, which is Atomic Habits. But basically this same thing gets applied in lots of different arenas. But potentially the popular version of this sense of like, if you can be 1% better every day, that is a much better way to achieve positive growth in your life than after New Year's, I'm just going to stop eating all bad food. I'm going to be on a diet and then it'll be successful. This idea of building up 1% advantages, I think can often, thinking about it that way can make it clearer. Whereas when you're in an organization, these 1% advantages that you can pick up, if extrapolated through all these various different parts of an organization, it requires alignment, but that can really deliver this idea of like, it's what underpins the idea of not failing, because so many parts of the organization are just getting that 1% better.
So there's a dual requirement here, a duality, right? So if everyone focuses just on the 1%, right, then the organization becomes optimized around a set of conditions at a point in time.
Yes.
Right. So really important here, while I 100% agree with you, good strategies, this idea of a cumulative advantage, this idea of, indifference to changing conditions, right? It's furthered by, let's just keep getting 1% better. If one of those things is to be a learning organization, we're constantly going to learn, we're going to share our learnings, we're going to promote people who share their learnings and occasionally do experiments. And okay, so yes, that's all aligned, but I will revert to one of our earlier points about it's not optimizing around a single set of conditions, right?
Yes.
You're getting 1% better in the direction of your set of strategic conditions that if you achieve them, it guarantees you get your definition of success.
Yes.
Right? You achieve those conditions, you get it all. Okay. If it's both optimizing for operations and in that direction, 100%, right? If it's just one or the other, we're not achieving that duality we spoke about. A good resilient strategy will do both, right? And this accumulative advantage is kind of part of that. You're getting more profitable, you're getting better quality, you're getting all of these things that accumulate advantage that get you more customers, more staff, more resilience, right? While working in this direction.
Yeah, great. And so then that brings us through to the plus component, which is where we're thinking about assumptions and prerequisites. And I think in particular here, I think a lot of people understand conceptually what an assumption is. But how is a prerequisite different from that, and why is it important to identify them as part of a strategy?
So in some ways, a tautology here in that, a prerequisite, something that you have to have, right? having it doesn't guarantee success or, won't ensure success in any way. Not having it ensures failure. Right? So this body of things that are prerequisites, right, fall into that grouping. Right? Now, assumptions, right, you have to make assumptions. Right? You can't operate in business without making assumptions because you never have perfect information. Right? So making assumptions like that, you just have to. But you want to be aware of them. You need to know which ones might kill your business versus which ones, you know what, we were wrong, but like it doesn't really matter, right? We don't want to be wrong, but it's not going to kill us. We can shuffle another $10 in that direction and cover that problem, right? So assumptions have a tremendous diversity of kind of pragmatic impact by nature, and they're just different, right? You have to have them. No matter what, you're going to succeed or fail, you're still going to make assumptions. Prerequisites, sorry, you don't have them, your probability of success falls to below 10%.
And I think this is a good call out, or the reason we would break this out is that assumptions, as you say, you have to have assumptions, but then they can be like, they're never ending. Like, depending on the level in which you're defining it, they are an infinitely long list. And so I guess how would you know where to focus? Like, everything's got assumptions in it. How do you know whether it's a resilient strategy or not?
Well, starting point, I would actually forgive the bait and switch here, but I would start with the prerequisites, right? You need to know what the prerequisite conditions are. If you define success, what must be true for that success to be achieved, right? What must be true to take you from where you are to that success? Typically, those things are fairly straightforward to identify and regularly just overlooked, and overlooked for a variety of reasons. But start with that. Accepting assumptions have to be made, right? Accepting you don't have perfect knowledge. When you think about those prerequisites, when you think about what expression of conditions, what expression of principles, how can you define this simple statement to all of your team that would serve this purpose, right? Okay, well, you don't have perfect information, so what assumptions underpin your view of those prerequisites or the effectiveness, the likely effectiveness of this strategy, right? There'll be more than one. Where do you not have complete information? Where do you have information that's rock solid, right? Versus, I think I know, versus, I'm pretty much just making this up, but it seems plausible, right? Okay, now, once you identify those things, just categorize them, right? Now assume it's wrong. That assumption is not the case. It's something radically different. It's something tiny bit different. If that destroys either one of the prerequisites or the presumed effectiveness of this strategy, right? Okay, you need to know about that straight up front. You need to eliminate that as part of your strategy, or okay, you're gambling again. Hopefully that was clear.
Yeah, so let's, I think it was, but I think it's also helpful to have examples.
Okay, so an example of an overlooked prerequisite, for those who are familiar with Kodak. Kodak, for those who aren't familiar, before digital photography, there was film, and film required chemicals to process that film and convert it to a print, and you got your photo as a print, before color printers and all that as well. So Kodak was one of the biggest, most successful companies in the world. Digital photography came along. They invented it. Okay, it was their decision to not support it. It wasn't a strategy to not pursue digital photography, but they had a strategy. We'll come back to that. The prerequisite here that was overlooked is that they made a decision. That they looked at their business and said, we are really good at manufacturing very specialized, high quality chemicals. Right? And let's be clear, they were. they were one of the preeminent, specialty chemical manufacturers in the world. Now, all their specialty chemicals, are the vast majority of them were to process film, but okay, we'll come back to this. They made a decision as digital photography started to bite into their business, right? That what they would do is to focus on their strength, and their strategy was to become a more diverse, a producer of more diverse specialty chemicals, and in particular, they were going to look at pharmacology, right? They were going to make medicines, right? Now, superficially on the face of it, hey, okay, this is a specialty chemical, it's complex, it's difficult to make, medicines are the same, right? Now, in this context, a prerequisite would be to actually have detailed experience, not just about the manufacturing of the product, but how the product gets to an end customer beneficiary user, right? Now, they had zero knowledge of that as a business, right? But nonetheless, they barrel down this path, right? Having overlooked a prerequisite of selling product to any customer, right? Going back to the evidence that supports this approach to strategy, right? A big piece of it is that all success in business depends on adoption. If no one adopts your product or your new offering or whatever it is, a service, right? If no one adopts it, you fail, right? 100% of innovation, 100% of new product development, 100% of research translation to impact, like 100% of organizational success requires adoption by a group of customers, users, and beneficiaries, right?
Yes,
and those all three can be different. Okay. Now, Kodak barreled down this path, right? They overlooked the very simple prerequisite of understanding, A, that adoption was required, and that the requirements of achieving adoption have nothing to do with manufacturing the product. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, there would be other examples. Foster's Brewing Group, led by their CFO, became the CEO, went, let's buy wineries, right? Wine and beer, they're sold in the same place. Like, certainly this makes sense, right? Now, Foster's had a very manufacturing beer process, and they did have relationships with distributors of alcohol, right? Same issue though, right? Huge prerequisite overlooked. How you obtain adoption of wine, what makes it successful, right? Why people buy it, largely different, not completely different, but sufficiently different that their lack of awareness about these things and their lack of awareness about the volumes of production, right? The economics of wine production, right? Were so different, and they didn't understand that, like, hugely expensive mistake, okay? Right, and that is very tightly related to what was then their strategy, right? They did have a simple strategy, right? They had a strategy that complied with many of our requirements, missed that one big time.
Yeah, and I think to underscore this idea that, I guess, as we're putting this framework together of what is a resilient strategy, there's kind of this idea that you need these components about communication, and can it be leveraged, can it be executed? And then you get to the end here, and its assumptions and prereqs is, I guess, an acknowledgement that to have a resilient strategy, the content of it matters. Like, there is an element that you can have a strategy that you can easily communicate, that everyone can work on, that would give you all of this accumulative advantage. It would tick all of those boxes, but can still be bad if you're missing this large piece of consumer knowledge or experience in a particular area. And I think often it's kind of put at the end, and I think there would be this tendency to rush through it. Oh no, we've put together this strategy. It's amazing. It's great. Don't think about it too hard. But that actually what you're saying or trying to do matters, and that pulling that information from the people who work from your organization is often the best way to get it. And Sorry.
Building
Yeah.
one is a methodical process.
Yes.
Right? To your point is it's not easy. It's not that it's hard. It's not that it's rocket science, but it is a methodical process that you have to execute like all the components.
Yes.
Or to your point, you might get something that ticks most of the boxes, but it only takes one to still be fatal.
Yes, and it takes time. And I think time can be a very dirty word. This sense that like it's not hard, but it takes time. And that's why this idea, I guess, came about, which is like, how do you make long-term decisions when everything is so short-term focused? And the idea would be that you create a robust strategy that you have for 5 to 10 years because you've developed it, you've proved it, it works. And then that is what's going to guarantee success over the long term. Also, having something that's here for a year to 2 years to 3 years is why it can be communicated, because people have ingrained it and it works. And so, yeah, certainly something about slow strategy or the slow development of this strategy is very important.
So long as you're surviving, then a methodical development of strategy and its communication and totally want to emphasize or feel it's incredibly important to emphasize, a good resilient strategy, an effective strategy does not change very often.
Yes.
Right? If it is, you're either throwing away a beautifully effective approach, right? Or it never was, right? These strategies, Disney's strategy largely set by the founder, right? But and through a few variations and changing of words, but basically the same thing, has sustained, 100 and something years, right? It's beautifully effective. Amazon's, however long they've been around, right? Like a good strategy doesn't change, right? Plans have to change. The decisions you make by applying the strategy as a tool to, do I prioritize this or that? Might. But the strategy itself doesn't, right? The lighthouse on the coast 100 miles out should still be the lighthouse for every employee, no matter where they're coming from, right? All heading in the same direction in an aligned way, right? And if you don't have that, then you do not have a good strategy. By definition, you are susceptible to changes in technology, changes in taste, fads, whatever else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that basically kind of brings us home. And I'll kind of say the last thing that I'd want to underscore here, and then I'll kind of leave it to you to tell me that I'm wrong or to add in anything that you feel like we've
So far telling you that you're right.
Yeah. But what I'd want to underscore is this. I think a lot of times we'll see an approach to create a strategy, and it is put something in this box. So who is your customer? And then the next one under that is like, what are their problems? What are their pain points? Like there are thousands of these frameworks. They all often have very similar overlapping things that they're asking you. But what happens is we have this completionist mindset where it's like, have I got something in that box? Have I got something in this box? Have I got something in that box? Well, then I must have a good strategy for my startup. Have I got everything on the slide? And I think that's often where the advice finishes. Whereas an approach where you're looking at, well, who are your customers? And, do they then tick off this list, right? Are there prerequisites there? Are they, does everyone know them? But this idea of like what you actually put in the box matters is something that I feel like comes back over and over again when we're thinking about a resilient strategy, because it's not do this to create, it's you have developed a strategy and then use these requirements to like anchor back as like, have we finished it yet? Have we finished it yet? Have we finished it yet? And it's like this overlapping of conversations or this repeating of conversations until you get to something that's resilient is different from what I've seen before and what I think I like about it the most.
Excellent. I'll be a little bit redundant and both add another piece of evidence in answer to one of your earlier questions, right? So there's a body of research that I was participant in with a team where we reviewed effectively all of the academic literature on methods or frameworks for assessing innovations, new products, strategies, et cetera, right? So in the technology space, and for me, this is just the one that pops into my head, is there's a technology readiness levels, right? It's a widely used framework. We also looked at all of the popular tools and frameworks, so canvases and I don't know, there's something in recoil, foil and recoil. There are a number of these, right? We looked at venture capital assessment tools, right? We took all of this stuff in and we went, okay, none of them work, right? Despite the existence of these things, we're still having a 90% failure rate, but what can we learn from this? Right? Now, long story short, okay, there's a body of evidence. What it does is focus down onto a reality that lots of people look at a box ticking exercise. They think that going through a series of steps will lead to an outcome, even if they don't have understanding of what those steps are actually about. Right? They look at intuitive, but in fact not causal relationships, right? You might think about if you're wondering if a company has an opportunity in growth and you look at the size of the market, well, intuitively it makes sense. If there isn't a big market, it's a tiny little market, you're probably going to be less successful. Okay, but here's the thing: is it's not causal. There is no causal association between the size of a market or the size of untapped overseas markets and succeeding and growing, right? No causal. It's correlated, no causation, right? If you think about those canvases, if you think about these tools, like I want to emphasize, lots of these tools are good. I use them, I teach them, they're useful. Only if you actually understand why the box is there in the first place. Only if you understand that, only if you understand that some of these boxes are not causally connected to success or a good strategy. Right? And that you really have to think through and be objective about what you know and what you don't know, right? Or this tool might get you into a fatal situation rather than a successful one, right? This approach, right, I would hope, right, it's simple, we can communicate it. We tick our own boxes here, albeit still want people to have some understanding, right?
Yes.
And not, this is a plug for business, but if you do have questions, like reach out, right? We want to explain these things in detail, right?
Yeah.
But yes, right, you have to have a fundamental understanding of the forces at play, right? If you don't, box ticking exercise isn't going to help you.
Yeah.
Right? You can follow a recipe and do an okay job and not starve, but you're not going to be a Michelin chef, right? You're not going to run a successful business.
Yeah. And look, I'll just add, and then I think we'll kind of finish up. But this sense that I think that analogy spoke to me a bit in that, like, with recipes and creating food, we are at a point where if you follow a recipe, you don't fail 90% of the time to make the thing that was advertised. But that's not the world we live in when it comes to business frameworks. Like going through and ticking, there's more businesses that go through and tick all the boxes in the business planning canvas. Business planning canvas?
Yeah.
Business planning canvas that fail than succeed.
Yes.
Like that is just the reality that we're in. And so I think what we're proposing here is not that those things aren't good or that they don't provide some value. They're just not a way that you can guarantee the kinds of success that I think you're hoping for when you're completing something like that.
And depending upon the size of your organization, right? But even as a small one, right? Running a successful business, not just for right now, not winning one customer, but winning customers and revenue and staff and all that's required, customers all the way through 5-10 years, right? If you think about the food example again, how you do different pieces of this in a way that doesn't have to change dramatically for periods of time, right? It would be like trying to cook 5,000 recipes all at once, right? That are radically diverse in context with a limited set of tools, right? the recipe is a great metaphor, but also a great metaphor for the fact that this is a much more complex, running a business is much more complex than making spaghetti sauce.
Yeah.
Right? There is no comparison given the magnitude of different things that are interacting. Right? Okay.
I can say to that.